My name is Blair McBride, and I will be doing a presentation on disabled men in America. I'm a part of Dr. Steve Rissman's multicultural men class at Metropolitan State University of Denver. I would like to give myself some background as to why I chose this topic. For starters, I have an interest in beginning a career in occupational therapy where I will be working intimately with this population. So I believe that it is my duty to have a better understanding of this culture of men in a more holistic realm. I also would like to have a better understanding of the clientele that I've previously worked with and the ones that I'm working with right now. I work in-home healthcare, as well as I worked in a nursing home where I worked very intimately with men that had disabilities ranging from Alzheimer's to terminal cancers and other such disabilities. I noticed that there's a barrier between my understanding of what their life is like and my ability to interact with them in a more engaging and meaningful way. I also worked at a summer camp for kids with disabilities, and for 1 week I worked with children that had muscular dystrophy. These were 13-year-old boys, and so there was already a gap between me kind of not being able to interact with such a young population of boys, but also it was really hard to kind of grasp their lives and how I can be a better assistance in understanding them. So that is the background as to why I chose this. So before I begin, I think it's critical to define what disability is. The general model of disability is that it's a physical or mental impairment that has long-term effects that can be carried out in a multitude of ways and has effects on their day-to-day lives. The medical model is centered around the individual and thinking that their disability needs to be cured or fixed. And then the societal model is more of a concept that an individual has an impairment of, they're lacking of a limb or their inability to speak. The list can go on and on. And these people have physical impairments, are excluded from participation in mainstream activities as well as mainstream media, and have a multitude of physical and environmental barriers that they must face. To begin, our disabled population is expanding, and currently 1 in 5 Americans at some point in their lives will experience disability. Surprisingly, women are more affected by disability than men, a comparison of 26.8 million women versus 25.3 million. But it's still really important to consider that that is 25 million men in our world that are living with disability. And obviously disability affects someone's life in every way possible, from their mental health, their emotional health, their physical self, their spiritual self, in every possible way. This is a very interesting statistic I found from Pew Research about the percentage of our population experiencing disability. As you can see, 49% are going to be our elderly population of over 49%. It also disproportionately affects Native American men over white men by 5%, and Asian men are the least likely to be affected. This report also shows a 0.2% increase in our female population that is experiencing disability. So the history of disabled persons is a little tragic and a little somber, but important to understand how we are where we are today. In the 1800s, a disabled person was considered a meager individual. They were considered not able to contribute to society and were considered of lesser intelligence, as well as forcibly going under sterilization without their consent. And more commonly, they were also kind of put away from society and most experienced being put into asylums where they lived very sad and pretty horrendous lives. And after kind of the 1930s, after our world wars, that's when we experienced that rush of veterans coming in with disabilities, and our society kind of had to react pretty quickly as to how to react and value these members of our that contributed to our country. So there was more technological advances as well as employment advances for these people. But it wasn't until the civil rights movement in the 1960s where disabled persons joined the rest of our civil rights activists demanding for a more collective scale of equal treatment in terms of social, occupational, and infrastructural changes. And it wasn't until 13 years later, in 1973, that the Rehabilitation Act was passed, and that was the first time in history that people with disability were protected by law. And this kind of includes going from housing security to making sure that they are equal opportunity employers, is kind of where that term stems from, as well as structural changes so that they had more ramps and more accessibility to transportation and other various societal roles. This was a very interesting pictures of men advocating for themselves during that civil rights movement in 1963. And then this is portrays kind of how we reacted after our veterans came home, trying to hire our handicapped population and putting them to work, because that is what that time period was kind of all about. The health of disabled men is a very interesting topic because I find it surprising, because you would think that having disability means that you would be going to doctors more often, but actually they're actually less likely to receive preventative health services, which include like cholesterol and blood pressure checks. And that's really important to understand that they're not doing that, and the majority of our population is the aging population that are not doing that. So that means a lot of these men are experiencing a lot of secondary conditions because of their lack of ability to go get these preventative services. Our healthcare system kind of is turning away from it. I think there's a change, but it's still very much a problem. The secondary health concerns vary from high cholesterol. 19% of people with disability had high cholesterol compared to 17%, so 2% increase, and 37% of adults with disabilities had diabetes, whereas only 29% did not have diabetes. So that means they're experiencing higher rates of diabetes, which has an entire component to how they're going to be able to contribute to society if they're even more disabled than they already need to be. The family life of disabled men is a complicated topic. First, disabled men struggle a lot with their financial and occupational place in the world. And that really is a burden to be a leader of the family in that way if you're not able to contribute in that way. So it's statistically shown, again through Pew Research, that Americans that are experiencing a disability earn about $10,000 less than a non-disabled person, and that's on the lowest scale. So the average makes about $21,000 as compared to $31,000. And a lack of employment and job opportunities is obviously that major factor into why that happens. I think it's also very important to understand that 65%, they have experienced a 65% unemployment rate, which is the highest unemployment rate or poverty rate of any minority in our country. Another huge issue that they face is a kind of a lack of understanding of their body and of their bodily functions, and that becomes a very scary burden to be such a physical burden onto one's family. And there's also a lot of emotional struggles that comes with not being able to fully contribute to family care and having meaningful interaction with their children and other familial ways. So their challenges in society is a multifaceted issue. I think it's very important to understand that the attitudes that society puts on disabled people is one of their biggest burdens that they face. The societal viewpoint is that, well, first, that there's a differentiation between races of how they're perceived. The white man will perceive a disabled person or another disabled man as an object of pity and admiration, and fundamentally different from a non-disabled person. Interestingly, Asian and Hispanic cultures tend to be very overprotective of their disabled men, which can really contradict their own masculine identities if they are not being an independent person. They have a lack of independence when their family tends to be overprotective and such like that. So there's two major theories as to the societal impacts that disabled men experience. The first one is the psychodynamic mechanism, and this is a societal belief that if a person does not feel bad about their disability, they must be in denial. This becomes a lot of very complex issues within that. If men already struggle with not being able to express their emotional selves, and if society expects them to feel bad, it's already a challenge to express themselves in one manner, but to express themselves in a very, very challenging manner can have long-term implications. I believe the spread phenomenon is one of the most important the spread phenomenon, I think, is the worst societal view that they have, and that's the belief that a disability affects one aspect in an individual, but it affects all aspects, including their emotional and mental health. And what I mean by that is that we'll view someone that has a physical disability, let's say paraplegia, where they can't move, and often people will view them as being mentally incapable, so that they will feel that they'll have a lack of social interaction, a lack of employment, and a lack of a lot of other realms, because people will also kind of fail to try to understand who they are as a person. Rather, they'll just first look at the disability and disregard any other contributions or who they are. So the impacts on masculinity are pretty wide-ranged because the traditional definition of masculinity kind of contradicts with everything that being disabled entails. So the trauma that they experience is conflicting, because they struggle with the social dynamics of the pressure of being masculine, being healthy, being independent, being physically active, having sexual prowess. And then also at the same time, they have to disprove society's perception that they are passive, incapable, and dependent men. And also along with that again is not having that common thing within all cultures of expressing themselves. So it's a very complex issue. So men typically attempt to kind of preserve their pre-disability self. This is if this disability showed up later in life, where they were once previously able-bodied, like a spinal cord injury. These kind of limits in their masculinity can impact their daily life. And they usually come with a lot of coping mechanisms to kind of inherently deal with these issues. These coping mechanisms include three. There's multiple different types of disabilities that people face, and different ways that they're going to cope with them. But the first one, the main one, is reformulation, which is someone will have a personal redefinition of their masculinity. And that can look like, let's say you have a disabled man that has to have a personal caregiver. Some men might see that as not being able to live independently, but if he redefines it as being this person, I have control over them, I can ask them what to do, then that gives them a sense of control and independence in their life, which is vital to their quality of life. The next one is reliance, which I believe is the most hurtful way of coping with a disability. It's men that heavily identify themselves with their masculine traits, like that power, strength, sexual prowess kind of thing. And when that happens, they will tend to not ask for help. They will be more prone to injury, more prone to emotional problems like mental health implications like depression, anger, all sorts of other mental impairments if they're not asking for the help they really need. And then the last one is rejection, and this one I think is the most powerful, and it's a complete rejection of any traditional understanding of what masculinity is. And they tend to believe that their mental capabilities definitely outweigh their physical limitations, and that's why typically these men are pretty successful. They will, such as Stephen Hawking, they pursue their mental self and tend to be very highly educated men, and really go into their continuing education. Next is sexual health. which is a little bit of a contradictory topic, but I think it's important because our sexual beings are an important part to every human being. There is some intimacy that struggles that a lot of disabled men face, and this is due to the perception that disabled men are not sexual beings. There's a lack of care and assistance. There's not really a focus on that in healthcare systems or in institutions on making sure that their sexual needs are met, and that kind of comes along because of that stigma of, that stigma of them not being sexual beings. And along with that, there is an overall societal view that expressing your sexual needs is kind of like, put under the rug, like don't talk about it. Statistically, they're less likely to have long-term relationships or be married than non-disabled people. But on the bright side, there is a growing movement for sexual assistance and surrogacy for disabled persons. The expansion of more handicapped sex toys, such as vibrating cushions and remote control masturbation devices. This can really enhance someone's day-to-day life and overall self, which is very important. It was also interesting to find that 37% of disabled men would consider paying for sex. So there is also a growing movement to try to legalize a sexual service for these men. It was a challenge to find trends within disabled men. I couldn't find the community or a lot of information on it, but what I did find that was interesting is that by 2030, the persons over the age of 65 years old will rise to 69 million from 34 million. That is almost a double increase in the next 10 years. And by 2050, those individuals over 85 will increase from 4.3 million in 2002 to 18.2 million. And along with that is going to come a lot of disabilities, because as we saw in that previous report, people with disabilities tend to be our older population. Another interesting statistic I found within the trends is that a growing number of disabled men are using dating websites. About 52% had reported using those, which I think is pretty great. So to summarize, I would like to just mention that I used the majority of my information from this really great book called The Psychological and Social Impacts of Illness and Disability. It was a fantastic read. If this topic is an interest to you, I would highly recommend reading it. They have some pretty interesting concepts. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.